And I say that...
Thank you for bringing me on.
I was hoping for a second head, and that was going to be Jonathan Liss, who is late as well. So, unfortunately, it's not... It's a bit of a shambles, our head-to-head this morning. But never mind, we shall struggle on. Though I've kind of got your views on a lot of what we're talking about already. But we will remind people of them. We didn't really get into what Kemi Badenoch had to say. I was just having a really interesting conversation there with Lord Robert Hayward about whether there's not enough nuance in the language that she's used about this, but whether the point itself is valid. Be interested to know what you think about this, of Kemi Badenoch saying, look, not all cultures are equally valid when it comes to immigration. Failing to recognise that is naive. She says that most politicians shy away from talking about immigration in terms of culture as opposed to economics. I think she's spot on, to be honest, because one of the issues I think that led to people's anger wanting to have Brexit, one of the issues I think that led to people's anger when it came to those awful riots, which were wrong, was that, you know, for so long, people, especially the southeast of England, who've got a lot of the benefits of immigration, have said, well, hang on, we've had an economic benefit of immigration, £6 billion a year, and look at our GDP, and all of these sorts of things around immigration, rather than actually sort of pointing out that those people who perhaps live in less privileged part of the United Kingdom, those people who are in parts of the UK that are a bit more socially deprived, they've not seen any of those billions that have come from immigration, and also they've perhaps seen some of their communities changing. So isn't Kemi Badenoch spot on by saying that immigration should be talked about more about culture rather than economics?
Possibly. I mean,
that was a long intro because we had to get Jonathan Liss in the studio while we put some pictures on the screen. But go on.
Possibly. I mean, I'm interested in the word valid that's used. I don't know if there's a validation. I'm not sure there is a validation sort of necessary, but I understand what she's trying to say. And there are questions about different cultures and different religions in this country. We are a diverse nation. I think we do better for that. We learn from each other. That's all absolutely fine. But I think when you hear the stories about, and they are not mainstream, so we have to be clear about this. This doesn't happen in every community. But if you've got things like the Rotherham or the Rochdale grooming gangs, which was predominantly large Pakistani men that preyed on young British white girls. Now, the police did nothing about it. The local councils did nothing about it. People were too afraid to call that out for what it was. And were too afraid to report or too afraid to step in through fear of being racist. So you don't want to be a country where you can't say these things because actually that was a systematic fear. That was an example, right? That is something that has happened and it's shocking in this country. And that should have been called out before. And it is not acceptable on any level for any man or any particular religion or any particular culture. Take another example of forced marriage, for example, still in this country. I think that's abhorrently wrong. I think, FGM that still goes on. It is...
So those are issues that have been imported through immigration into this country that perhaps are not discussed enough because the benefits of immigration financially that we've had, which is true, we have. I mean... those are the things that are perhaps discussed a bit more rather than the culture. OK, that's what Kemi Badenoch has said. Jonathan Liss, you are now here, looking lovely this morning, as always. I actually have a message from someone saying, I'm listening on the radio, so please describe what Jonathan's wearing. I actually had that message a little earlier, so I must do that before you go. What do you think? You caught the tail end of that. I don't know whether you're aware of her comments this morning.
Yeah, I am, yeah.
Do you think that that's a fair point that she's making, that actually we seem to forget that perhaps certain cultures, or within certain cultures, people don't just leave that behind at the border as soon as they arrive in the UK, or perhaps they are first or second generation in the UK. Those cultures still have those non-British elements, non-British values, and actually we need to discuss that more.
I mean, I suppose the first thing to say to that is that we never stop discussing migration. This bizarre myth, this story that we tell ourselves in this country that we can't talk about immigration, well, that is the conversation that we have more than basically any other, it seems sometimes. So I just refuse the basic premise that we don't talk about it. We do really talk about it. In FGM, for example, has been illegal in this country for many years. Now, there weren't any prosecutions until relatively recently, but it's simply not true, the fact that we have this incredibly permissive culture towards practices that we might consider deeply harmful. And I suppose that the problem with FGM in particular, it's children. So I think that there's a debate that has been happening for centuries, actually. I studied it, actually, it was part of my master's degree, this idea of how you deal with cultural encounters when you have particularly British people going to different parts of the world that they were colonising and discovering practices that they found abhorrent, and how we deal with that now, because the practices we agree were abhorrent. So the examples that are often given are FGM, for example, or sati in India in the 18th and 19th century, where widows would sometimes burn themselves on the pyre of their husband's funeral pyres. And the role in how you sort of square stopping that, while also recognising that you do not have a kind of cultural supremacy, and recognising that those cultures are frequently contested within the cultures themselves.
Do we not have a cultural supremacy over a culture that will endorse female genital mutilation?
The point is that a lot of cultures will first of all dispute whether that is a sort of part of their culture, or if it's something that is practiced by some people. And you also turn the mirror back on our own culture and see many things that we do that are harmful as well.
But but I think the point is, though, that that's not, there may be many issues that we have in this country that other countries might disagree with, but for want of a better phrase, they're ours. Whereas things like FGM or other things like that, we're importing, we're almost creating new problems for ourselves by bringing them in here. And I think, just to pick up on your point about immigration not being discussed, I don't think Kemi Badenoch is saying that. She's saying that the counter-argument to that always seems to be economic. How can we demonise immigration when we've had such a brilliant economic benefit from it, when in actual fact what is discussed less, for fear of the xenophobia that she describes, is those cultural elements?
But actually, I've always said that migration is an unalloyed cultural good as well. So I'm never one of those economics-only migration advocates. And I think it's also really important to point out that the numbers of people who are doing things like FGM are absolutely tiny, not only in sort of proportion to the number of migrants that we get in this country, but even
grooming gangs you wouldn't say was tiny, though.
Well, grooming gangs is actually tiny in comparison to the number of people who are guilty of rape and sexual assault in this country, even against children.
But within the Islamic Pakistani community, it's not tiny. Within that demographic, it's not tiny.
It's
within the demographic of when you look at the proportion in comparison, you're right. There are, of course,
but it's tiny. But I'm saying it is tiny, even
in comparison to the whole of community of white people. Yes,
in comparison to even the Pakistani community of this country, it's a tiny, tiny fraction. The idea that there's a sizable minority of Pakistanis who are involved in that sort of abhorrent...
No, but it's disproportionate when you consider the number of Pakistani Muslims in this country, and then the number of Pakistani Muslims in proportion who are part of Islamic grooming gangs, as opposed to the proportion of white people. I don't even call them
Islamic grooming gangs. They're nothing to do with the
Pakistani.
They're nothing to do with the religion of Islam.
Well, some people would argue that it would be.
No, I don't think that we can call them Islamic grooming gangs.
They're Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs, because some people would argue that it's because of the fact that there is a contingent of some people within the Islamic community, and I'll probably be pilloried for saying this, that would look at the teachings of the Quran that have someone underage in there that would have corresponded to that. And secondly, as well, they are choosing those girls based on their race.
You can call that. Look, I don't think that we can go down the route of saying that child abuse has a kind of monopoly for one religion.
I'm not.
I know you're not. But like when you look at sort of when we talk, go back even a couple of generations in my own religion, sort of Judaism, plenty, in the Sephardi tradition, girls were married off 12 in some parts of the world. Not so long ago in this country, girls are married off at sort of 10 or 11 as well.
And is there a massive issue now in the UK with, as was seen in the Rotherham prosecution 2 weeks ago, of 1,000 girls, 1,100 actually, I think it was, that were groomed since, I think, 2005 by Jewish men who were looking at what was happening within your religion and say, well, actually, that's a justification in our minds for that happening. That's why I accept, of course, every religion has dodgy parts of the book that might talk about something underage or something that is absolutely distasteful, but that's... When there is a Jewish grooming gang problem, well, then we'll talk about that.
I think it's just you get into problems when you sort of ascribe big problems to cultures or religions themselves. Individuals are fundamentally responsible for what they do. No, I don't think you can say my culture made me do it. So I think that that's also a real problem with where Badenoch's going, because people have all kinds of influences in their lives. I don't think that people are bad people because of their culture, and I think it's a dangerous track for her to go down by suggesting that some things are British, some things are not British, some cultures are good, some cultures are less good, frankly.
You have not gone down well, Jonathan Liss, with your comments, I'm afraid.
I would, you do surprise me.
Of course, sometimes, says Mark in Southampton, we were talking about, just in case you're just joining us, we were talking about Kemi Badenoch's comments this morning.
I'm sure, can I just say, I think it is Badenoch. She gets annoyed when people say Badenoch.
Badenoch. Sorry, because that's the most important thing here. Badenoch's comments.
She could be the next Prime Minister, Christo. He's got it right.
Oh, if only, if only. Oh, I think we just take a moment for that fantasy. OK, not all cultures are equally valid when it comes to immigration, and failing to recognise it is naive, and that immigration is discussed far too often in economic terms rather than cultural terms. I'll come to your answer in a moment on that, and but a lot of people are saying that either you're in denial, that or that you are not acknowledging that there is an element of some people, not all. I think it's really important to use the word some in this, and I think that's what Kemi's not doing here, but that among some who are within the Pakistani Muslim community, that Islamic element is a part of their justification in their own minds for their horrific grooming of these young girls. Some people calling you an apologist, some people saying, look, of course an element is their culture or religion that makes them do it. This is just one example. Kemi isn't talking particularly about grooming gangs, but can you just very briefly, before I come to Charlie, respond to those criticisms?
I'm not in denial about anything. I think that we have, of course, there are problems with migration, sometimes with levels of integration, and there are people who might have attitudes that are not shared. But what I object to is a sort of characterisation of one culture as being a certain way, posited against a more virtuous home culture. I just don't think that British culture is inherently better or more virtuous than other cultures.
Charlie, what do you make of all that you've heard from Jonathan this morning, and specifically on the grooming gangs, which seems to be the biggest example and the most pertinent, because a couple of weeks ago, huge prosecutions, over 100 years, a massive Rotherham grooming gang was jailed for, and by the way, barely made any headlines.
Yes.
It was the same week as Hugh Edwards. Everyone was talking about Hugh Edwards, but actually, in comparison, as repellent as Hugh Edwards was, comparison to Hugh Edwards, barely any headlines on crimes that were despicable in comparison.
Yes, and you can add sort of honour killings to that and that kind of example. And I think what we've got to do. So my biggest worry is that I think we do celebrate, and we should celebrate. So I agree with Jonathan, the cultural element of immigration as well. We do. We celebrate all different religions and religious days and festivals, and rightly so. That is something that goes on, and that is absolutely right. But I think whilst we celebrate that, we at the right level. I wouldn't say we over-celebrate it, but I'm trying to make the point that, we over-celebrate in one sense, but we then report and underestimate the downsides and the difficulties and all the issues that we've just been talking about. So I think you've got to get the balance right of saying, no, we're an equal, diverse society. We'll absolutely celebrate all of the cultures and religions that we have that make us a great nation, but we shouldn't be afraid in calling out the issues that we've just been talking about when you do hear these stories. My worry is that we tend to be, I would never call Jonathan an apologist, like but we do have a tendency, I think, to, or some perhaps on the left, not necessarily you, Jonathan, but, you know, some on the left will have this inertia to say, oh, well, you know, you can't just sort of call out that religion or that culture or that sort of, you know, group or that sort of, you know, street, because, you know, actually everybody's at it. And actually, you know, it's always going to be, you know, take the prison population, well, the majority are white British men, so, you know, they're the thugs in this society, rather than, no, that is not correct. So I think we have to be very, very clear, and even though it's Kemi Badenoch, senior political figure within the Conservative Party, Badenoch, I beg your pardon, you know, running for the leadership, it's going to create a lot of people on the left, again, I'm not including Jonathan in this necessarily, but, you know, a lot of people on the left will then sort of completely go the other way because it's Kemi Badenoch from the Conservatives making a point about immigration. So it would be very easy for people on the left to just call her out and criticise her, to say, oh, well, she's just being a racist, or she just doesn't get, she's a right-wing crackpot. You know, that's what when we just need to have a very, very serious and frank and upfront conversation about certain cultures, certain religions in the UK that do act and have acted in the way that they have, that we haven't reported, that we haven't spoken about it enough, and you need to get that balance right about celebrating the cultures and religions that we have in this country, as well as identifying where there are problems where young girls who are from different religions do not have the education necessarily in this country that they should have by going to schools, where actually schools and parents from different cultures and religions turn up at the school gate to demand that schools don't teach about certain things. That is wrong. That should not be happening in the United Kingdom.
Charlie, that happens in Christianity as well. There are so many hardline religious Christians.
Where? What schools does that happen?
There are plenty of hardline...
Where? I'm not defending
If you let me finish, there are plenty of hardline Christian parents who, for example, who vigorously oppose homosexuality, for example, and have also protested, you know, when their children have been taught about homosexuality. That might be about sort of Christian fundamentalism that sort of transcends different cultures within Christianity.
But never have I heard of a Christian protest around what is being taught in school that would result in an exclusion zone around the school, or a teacher needing to go into hiding. Isn't there the difference? I think that if you're a Christian parents, Jewish parents, whatever, and you want to object to something, that is your fundamental democratic right. But
I think the point is that
I've never heard of teachers needing to go into hiding because of those objections, rather than any other culture.
The problem comes when you take a number of individuals within a certain group who are doing bad things and then extrapolate from that a problem with the culture itself. So, for example, during the 90s and the Zeros, when the full scale of the Catholic Church's abuse scandal was coming to light, I did not remember anyone talking about, do we need to talk about a problem within Catholicism? Is this a problem for Catholic people to answer for? Why are so many of their priests turning out to be vicious paedophiles who have sort of, you know, abused so many children? That was never about a problem about Catholicism, rightly so. It was about a number of priests within the Catholic faith, and that was not necessarily sort of a reflection of Catholicism itself. And when you come from the dominant culture, you do tend to have, and I will use a word that's going to annoy people, privilege. That when you're a white person, when you're a Christian person, when you're in the dominant culture, you get to act for yourself. What you do does not represent the culture. When you are a black person or a person from an ethnic minority or a sort of smaller culture, what you do is people say, see, that's what they do. And that's the problem that I think we need to fight.
But we've got to take another quick break, then I will come to you. I know you keep having to come back after the break. I think what is the fair point there, and it was the point I made to Lord Robert Hayward, is that I would have probably worded it that there are some within cultures rather than some cultures, some within cultures, because then that doesn't imply the whole culture, which I think is important when it comes to the nuance. But the principle of the point that she's making, I actually completely understand. And when we return, I mean, there seems to be the dominant story. We'll let you respond to that, and then we might... did you just wink at me when I said that? Yeah, thank you. That was... no, I don't know. I had a little flutter there, Charlie. Jonathan doesn't wink at me. Jonathan barely acknowledges me most of the time. You wanted to respond to Jonathan's answer regarding, well, British culture, whether we're importing people who don't have British values, as according to Kemi Badenoch, and What do you want to say to what Jonathan had to say to that? Charlie.
Yeah, I have. Yes, yeah. Well, I was going to. I forgot what I was going to say now. But,
all right, well then, fair. No, go on.
Well, I think again. I mean, look, Jonathan's very good there at sort of detailing historical past, with the Catholicism and the Catholic Church, and that's of its time, and that was in the 90s, the 2000s, as you said. But now, of course, you would call it out. But I still doesn't think that answers the question about the particular teachings in schools where you have a certain religion. Mob of people that turn up at the school gates versus anyone. And I think we just lose, if we're not able to call that out and say that is a particular religion or a particular culture, then I think we lose the argument. I think that's why not being able to speak out so frankly about that. We should have spoken out in the 90s and 2000s about Catholicism and the issues in the Catholic Church. We didn't. That was a failure of the past, but that doesn't mean
it's not quite my point now. It's not quite the point I was making.
No, he was making the point that basically we don't generalise. We don't say there's an issue within Catholicism of grooming as a direct result of them being Catholic priests that were abusing children. No, but we don't then relate it to that being a Catholic problem.
It becomes an individual, and obviously you talk about the Catholic Church, but not the Catholic religion.
But it goes to your point earlier on that there is a disproportionate number of people within that church group that were taken part.
And it's not just
historic, and therefore we should have called that, and we know that now. And this could be happening in other cultures and communities. And the fact that we haven't called it out or looked into it is why there is this cultural divide that Kemi's talking about. And which might have been the reason that sparked the riots.
But I'm saying it's not Catholicism that made the priest do it. That's what I'm saying.
Before you respond, I want to read you what Ralph in Liverpool has said. Okay. And he said that there is he points out that there is a problem within Islam, not with Islam in general, but within the culture within Islam. 7/7 attack on London, Lee Rigby murder by decapitation, Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs, London Bridge attack, second London Bridge attack, Westminster attack, Batley Grammar School teacher in hiding, Mike Frears MP forced to step down, MP Sir David Amos murder, MP Stephen Timms stabbed, Reading murders, 3 dead, Manchester Arena 22 children dead, little boy who damaged a Quran and the apology that was required, plus abroad Charlie Hebdo, Bataclan's 9/11, Paris Stadium attack. Those are all with, or pretty much all of them. I know you perhaps take issue when it comes to the grooming gangs, but those are all people of the Islamic faith with an extreme version of that within different countries other than where they would have migrated from as either first or second generation, who are using their interpretation of the Islamic faith in order to justify those actions. Isn't that precisely the point that Kemi is making, and precisely the point that perhaps you're missing according to this texter?
No, and if you look at the people who represent or who speak for Muslim people, they do not justify those attacks in any way, and they sort of talk about how that is a perversion of the Islamic faith. If you're talking about is it the culture itself, then the people who are best placed to talk about it say this is a perversion of Islam. Now, no one's denying that. No
that doesn't make it the whole of Islam.
But this is what we're talking about, though. We're talking about whether it's a culture itself. And I'm pointing out the people who are in that culture saying it is not. It is a perversion of it. And, of course, we know there are many different kinds of communities and groups that sort of are extreme and violent. And, obviously, in this country right now we have, for example, a far-right terrorist problem. But it's not a problem with white people. It's a problem with people who are, a particular subset of a community who are going out and threatening people, as we saw in the riots, for example. That was sort of far-right terrorism in some ways.
What do you want to say to that?
Well, it is just about having the ability to call it out, and all of those examples that texter has just said are absolutely right. That it comes from radical Islamic background. But if you have so take just Lee Rigby, awful killing outside Westminster. Now, we don't know that individual, not saying that they're a part of the wider Islamic faith, but they're clearly a radicalised individual. If we as a society, as a British society, were able to identify that individual earlier, know who they were, be able to say, hold on, this person is acting a bit strange, or I think I've heard them through my next door neighbour, and I've heard them listening to some sort of awful videos night after night, or whatever it is. If we don't have that, but I'm too afraid to say anything because they're a particular colour or particular race or particular religion.
Or I'll get accused of being xenophobic.
Or be accused of being... Exactly. We don't have the ability to call things out or to report things, or because of the fear of being... That is the problem.
Or Charlie, the Prevent programme has literally existed for just that purpose.
Of course, but I'm talking about ordinary members of the public. We might not know about that.
Okay, fine, but I just don't.
But that is the
I
point.
don't know
but
what
what's wrong with what I've just said? What's wrong with what I've just said?
I don't know what we're supposed to be calling out. I think that we can absolutely.
Worries,
there is a worry and concern in this country.
No.
Because you said at the start, you said at the start that you think that we talk about immigration too much in this country.
I didn't say that.
All right, okay, we do mention it enough. But
I say we don't not talk about it at all. I think that in a way what you've said illustrates my point, because we do need to talk about individuals. We talk about individuals, of course. If there are individuals,
but I think Charlie's point is that why can't we mention that there may be an issue within a culture that doesn't represent the whole culture, but why can't people say that without the accusations of being xenophobic, or report it without those accusations?
No,
I think that's his point.
Literally no one is denying that there is a radical strain within Islam that's led to...
I've got to call a halt. Thank you.